Welcome back. We are at, I think, the halfway point, but what is time in 2021? Time has no existence of what the fuck is cloud native. Have you been sharing what you've learned? Have you been learning things? Let us know what you think at hashtag WTF is cloud native. And ask questions. It's important. It's hard to be a speaker online. Yeah, they don't have to travel and all, but they need feedback. We all need feedback. We all need to learn from each other. So I think we're all really excited to learn from this one. Cheryl Hung is going to talk about 3 years inside the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which is definitely near and dear to my heart because open source has a lot of great potential and a lot of problems, especially in diversity, equity, inclusion. So I'm excited about an insider's perspective, and take it away, Cheryl. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I definitely would love to engage with everyone as much as possible. So please do feel free to ask questions. I'm on Twitter at Cheryl as well. So if you want to find me afterwards, then you can always find me. So my talk today is in two sections, really. The first section is a bit about these lessons learned and how CNCF changed the way that I think about open source, about community, about just my career. And I'll give a few little stories and interesting things that stuck with me that I found interesting, and I hope you'll find them interesting as well. And then the second half of my talk is a look back over 2021, since we are now heading into November. Yes, gosh, nearly the end of the year. And just look back at some of the trends of cloud native over the past year. A little bit about me before I go into things. I started out as an engineer at Google using Borg to deploy Google Maps. I was a software engineer writing C++. So that's kind of how I got started with, I guess you could say I've been thinking in cloud native and containers since about 2010. I left Google in 2015. Among other things, creating a meetup called Cloud Native London, which I still run today. We have more than 6,000 members and we run monthly events. So if you want to get to know other people, actually not so much in London now, more across the UK, then please feel free to find out about Cloud Native London as well. I spent 3 years at CNCF, so between 2018 to 2021 this year. And then most recently, I joined Apple as an engineering manager on the Apple Cloud Services team. So Apple being Apple, I'm not really going to talk about, I can't really discuss anything Apple related, certainly not from the infrastructure perspective, which is why I've really focused this talk on those 3 years at CNCF and what made those different and what I've learned from it. Okay, so the first part of this talk, how CNCF changed the way I think. So I'm going to go back to pretty much the beginning of how I got involved with CNCF, and then just give you some of my thoughts on some things that I found interesting from my time there. So this was, the story is called The Closest Thing in Public Service in Tech. And this comes from probably middle of 2018 when I was interviewing with CNCF. And people ask me, how do you join CNCF? Because it's a bit of a strange organization. Generally, it doesn't really, there aren't a lot of positions and they're not widely advertised. So the truth is that I was at a startup at the time. I was involved in community work through my meetup, through Cloud Native London. And through attending some of the conferences, I had gotten to know Chris Anchik, who is the CTO of CNCF. I'd met him once, maybe once or twice. And at the time, I was looking around. I had a job offer from Amazon, from AWS. And I was a bit uncertain about whether I actually wanted to take the job offer at AWS. And I thought, well, there's no harm in reaching out to Chris and finding out if there's anything coming up at CNCF, right? And that is literally what I did. I Slacked him on the CNCF Slack channel and said, hey, Chris, I'm looking around. Do you think there is anything that I would be a good fit for? And he said, yes, we're hiring for this director of ecosystem role. You would be amazing. We haven't actually got it formally approved yet, but once we've approved it, please come and interview for it. So it was kind of a bit of good luck and timing as well, because I just so happened to be looking and reaching out at that time that job post was being was kind of coming up. But this particular quote comes from the interviews, and it comes in particular from Jim Zemlin, who is the executive director of the Linux Foundation. The Linux Foundation is the parent foundation for CNCF. And one of the things that he told me was the Linux Foundation is not structured like a typical company is. A typical company has customers and stakeholders and shareholders that financially you need to worry about those from a finance perspective, whereas the Linux Foundation is structured as a non-profit, and it's the closest thing that you're going to find to public service in tech. The goal is like, try and do the right thing for the community. Don't worry so much about the money side of things. I mean, yes, there are marketing and salespeople and so on, but that stuck with me because truly and honestly in tech, we don't have a lot of roles that are really public service in that way. We don't have many roles where we can just, say we're just trying to do the right thing. We're not trying to, open source we're not trying to make any money. We're not trying to, do anything, make particular profits from this. And I think that is what attracted me to CNCF in the first place. Of course, Amazon has done extremely well over the last 3 years. So financially, I definitely could have done better by going to Amazon. But I do think that the idea of public service, the idea of sort of reaching out and doing the right thing for people, kind of solving people's problems and helping them, is something that's quite unique about CNCF. So I put this in to sort of give you the context of what makes CNCF different from a typical job, let's say. So that was my first story. The second one comes from Dan Cohn, who was the executive director of CNCF. And this one's called After CNCF You Could Be. During the interview process, I spoke to Dan. Dan was kind of an intimidating guy, right? Like very jovial, had a really big voice, like really booming voice. And I really remember the first time I spoke to him, and I was waiting at my kitchen, waiting for this phone call. I picked it up and I was like, "Hi, I'm Cheryl." And he was like, "Hi, Cheryl, I'm Dan Cohn, Executive Director of CNCF. And after CNCF, you could be a VC, you could be an entrepreneur, start your own company, you could be, you could join one of our member companies." And I was pretty flummoxed by this because I was like, hold on, this is the first time I've ever spoken to this guy. I expected myself to be, trying to persuade him why I would be good for this job. And literally the first thing he says to me is, well, when you're done with CNCF, you could do all these other things. And I just thought that was so amazing. The idea that you could go into an interview and the question is not, can you check off these things today and do them today? The question was, how could I help you to be able to do something even bigger in the future? How could I give you the opportunities to expand what you could do? And for that, I think Dan really, really taught me a lesson in that. One that I try and take whenever I meet new people, particularly when I'm interviewing, that the question should not be, do you fit into exactly what I'm looking for today? The question is, how can I give you more opportunities to do the things that you want to do and to find things that you can't necessarily do yourself today, but maybe after a year or a couple of years, you would be able to do them. So that's the second story. After CNCF, you could be. The third one is called Failure is an Option. And this one comes from about probably 2-3 months after I started at CNCF. And I had talked to a lot of people. I was trying to figure out what to do effectively. Talked to a lot of people, started formulating some ideas about what I could do with this end user community that I was running. And I had come up with a list of maybe 10 different things that I could do. I took them to my manager, Dan, at the time. And I said to him, look, we could start some more personal conversations with people, like checking with them regularly. We could launch some marketing efforts, like more email newsletters. We could come up with some new programs where we put the end users with the open source maintainers together. And he listened to these all very seriously, very gravely, and then just very, very gently and quietly told me, Cheryl, failure is an option. Don't worry so much about trying to do the perfect thing today or trying to predict in advance which one's going to be the perfect one. Try a lot of different things, and it's okay if those fail. I think we all have this fear of failure. We all have this fear of putting ourselves out there and people telling us that, we're not good enough, that what we're talking about is not correct. And as soon as I heard that from him, I was like, oh, you know what? It is not a big deal if I launch something, it doesn't go particularly well, and then I unlaunch it again. And I'm very, very grateful to him that he gave me that air cover, that confidence to be able to try a lot of different things. And I particularly tie this to the idea of a scarcity versus abundance mindset. So if you think that resources are scarce and the world is a difficult place, then your instinct is to kind of shrink inside and only do the things that you're comfortable with and not invest into things that could potentially fail because you think, oh, if I fail, that means I've lost something. Open source is really different. Open source is the more you try, the more people you get involved, the more different ideas you can bring to the table, the more likely it is that some of those will become something really big and something really successful and bring a lot of people with it. And I think in order to work successfully in open source, you have to have this idea, this mindset of abundance. Be generous with your time, be generous with your advice, bring people together, start new things, and just don't fear failure so much. So not easy, but that's one lesson that I really took from Dan, that failure is an option. Failure is absolutely okay. Not to fail all the time, but if you're not failing at all, that probably means you're not doing enough things. Okay, next one. I have 2 more stories after this. Treat your career like your portfolio. This one comes from a few years into CNCF. Once I'd established myself and I'd started to get known within the community for working with end users, for working with CNCF. And one of the things that I was receiving more and more of towards the end of my time at CNCF was invitations to do work outside of CNCF. For example, to speak at conferences, to advise for startups, to write blog posts and so on. And I asked Chris Anshik, the CTO, are these things acceptable? Should I be doing these or should I not? And Chris looked at me and he said, Cheryl, treat your career like your portfolio. Just diversify as much as you can. Get involved as many opportunities as you can, because those are the things that are going to pay off in the future. And in this, I think he was absolutely right. I think it's very difficult for most of us because our companies usually try and say, you know, you have to do all your work within a single company. This is even true of Apple, perhaps famously so, where I am now. They're quite secretive about and restrictive about doing things outside of Apple. But if you can diversify your career and get involved with other things, and bring other people, meet other people outside of your own company, that will give you the long-term returns that are very hard to do within a single company. And since leaving CNCF, I've definitely felt that to be the case. You know, you always maintain the relationships you have with them. I'm very lucky even to maintain the relationships with Container Solutions. You've invited me to speak today. So treat your career like your portfolio. Get involved with events, get involved with conferences, talk to people, put yourself out there, and hopefully over time, remember, failure is an option. Some of those won't play out, but hopefully over time, you'll pick up these things and they'll give you other opportunities in your career that you won't be able to find yourself. So, okay, this is my last story. This one comes from earlier this year. Yes, early in 2021. And this one is a bit more of a difficult story for me. And I probably can't give all of the details at this point. But for context, I recently announced that I am pregnant. In fact, I am due to give birth in about 4 weeks' time, which feels very, very soon, 4 or 5 weeks. And at the beginning of the year, so let's say March, April time, I knew that I would be due to go on maternity leave around December onwards. And so I started making preparations, work-wise, career-wise. And unfortunately, the response that I got from my manager was not enthusiastic, shall we say. This is the bit where I'm going to sort of not give all of the details at the moment, but the upshot of it eventually was that I knew I needed to find somewhere else, an environment where I would be fully supported with my need for maternity leave. I interviewed for a few different companies at that point. And one of the companies that I spoke to, Apple, in fact, I told all of the companies, you know, I told them after I got the offer, but before I signed a contract, that I was pregnant, I would need to go on maternity leave. And the response from the recruiters at Apple was amazing. Like, brilliant, please come do your leave here. We really want you to come back after your leave and rejoin the team, and you would be fantastic. And I was so relieved to hear that that was the response, because the response that I had previously received was so ambivalent that I actually ended up filing a HR complaint over it as I left CNCF and the LF. So it was just a very different response. And that was one of the reasons as well why I decided to join Apple, because they were not just, accepting that I would go on maternity leave, but they were actively enthusiastic about it. And the reason I tell this story is because this ties into what I think diversity and inclusion really means. I'm pretty lucky. I've been pretty lucky within my career, even though being of a gender and ethnic minority, for the most part, I've still managed to find a lot of success and joy and happiness in my career. And at this point in my life, when I was pregnant, was a point where I really, really needed the support. And I really understood the difference between diversity in the kind of shallow sense, the diversity of, oh yes, we use I don't know, pictures of women in our marketing. We use, we change naming so that we remove problematic terminology, or we do unconscious bias training, versus actively supporting enthusiastically the people when they need the support. So I would say if diversity is a priority for you and for your organizations, then I would ask that you think very closely about what that really means, because diversity is more than just, saying things that sound good and easy and good for the moment. They're about making very, very difficult decisions and doing those enthusiastically so that the person you're supporting knows why you're doing those. So that is the kind of upshot. That is the ups and downs, let's say, of my time at CNCF. I did learn a lot about open source, about how to think about the community, about reaching out to people with generosity and this abundance mindset. And I also learned a lot about the difference between diversity from a corporate perspective versus a personal experience. So yeah, it was a very, very interesting ride. With that, I'm now going to switch to the second part of my talk, which is called Cloud Native in Review for 2021. And first of all, I'm just going to set the scene a little bit from where I joined Cloud Native to where it is today. So Cloud Native is still accelerating, and let's look at that from a couple of different perspectives. So this was a survey taken, I believe, end of 2020. So it's actually a little bit old now. But the survey asked, are you planning to use more or less cloud due to COVID-19? And of a couple of hundred respondents, 57% of those said that they that they actually used slightly higher or significantly higher than what they had planned. Kubernetes searches are still going up by more than 2,000% in the last 4 years. Cloud container expertise is still very, very highly in demand. This comes from the 2020 Open Source Jobs Report, again published by the Linux Foundation. In the last reports from CNCF, 83% of the respondents said that they run Kubernetes in production, 92% that said that they run containers in production. And the container one is particularly kind of amazing to look at. These bars represent all of the previous surveys that have been run from March 2016 up until 2020. You can see that 4 years ago, it was not even 5 years ago, sorry, it was less than 25% of people run containers in production. And then by 2020, it was 92%. So just amazing adoption in that time. Looking at the CNCF projects, this comes from one of the KubeCon. I think the very first KubeCon that I went to in Berlin, and there were 7 CNCF projects at the time. And today there are just over 100, I believe. So the number of projects has really exploded. With that comes a huge contributor community. More than 139,000 people have contributed in some way to the CNCF project across 7 million contributions. Those contributions are, generally the ones on GitHub, so things like pull requests, issues, commits. So it doesn't even include things like tech writers, marketers, all of the other stuff that happens around the code itself. And very early on, we saw that the US and Germany, actually France and the UK, were the top contributors to the CNCF project. China is actually up and coming, like a really big one as well. So yeah, just the range of contributions and number of contributions is really increasing. Of course, with all of that extra new projects, the pace of things moving faster and faster, comes a lot of challenges. And in the same CNCF survey from 2020, you asked, what are your questions when using and deploying containers? And the top two responses here were complexity and cultural changes with development. And I wanted to focus on complexity for this bit, because I think complexity, the goal is to simplify, or to try and simplify what we're doing. But actually we end up adding a lot of complexity. And the question is, how do you stay on top of all the complexity that's coming up? And I think we have a very, I'll show you a very quick video. This video comes from the US Department of Defense, and we'll watch it and then I'll explain why I think this is quite funny.
The DoD Enterprise DevSecOps Initiative is a joint team with the DoD CIO, OSD, the Air Force, and DISA. So we're really trying to streamline the process and what it takes to take a program to DevSecOps using Kubernetes and OCI compliant containers. So giving us the ability to move faster and be able to continuously push software and update software, particularly when it comes to AI and machine learning and cyber offense and defense is critical. For us, of course, security is a must. That's why we call it DevSecOps. The sec is not just doing some static dynamic analysis on your code. That's a given. We're going to the continuous monitoring side of the house with zero trust baked in, with a behavior detection model, really pushing the envelope when it comes to security, and kind of merging the best practices on the cyber side with the DevSecOps community. We went to the team and said, can you put Kubernetes and Istio on the jet? And we didn't want to change the hardware of the jet, so that's legacy hardware, no cheating, that had to be able to boot from scratch in 2 minutes with the microservices and the Istio stack running. And what was incredible is the team was able to bring Go, Java, Python, and modern programming languages using microservice architecture as well. So we had Go running on the jet, which is a big difference from Ada. So we were able to do that in 45 days. It's pretty incredible because once you can deploy fast and iterate and learn fast and fail fast, but don't fail twice for the same reason. I think the key aspect there is that it's compounding the time savings, and it's very tough to have a very precise number, but we're thinking at least 100 years was saved across the 37 programs already. If Kubernetes is good enough for the DoD and our weapon systems, it's certainly good enough for your business.
All right. So I think this is a little bit, I always find this funny because, it's very American, it's very over the top from a British or European point of view, I think. But the interesting thing about this is Kubernetes, containers, Istio are all getting deployed in areas that weren't really thought of a few years ago. I think classically the idea is very much of a web app, of something that you're going to run in a data center, and you're going to run it across a very large number of servers. And so the fact that now you're finding containers and Kubernetes in environments that are unusual, that are not planned for the way that, not expected early on, means that, again, there's just more complexity in how things are done, and therefore you have to find a way to tame that complexity. Start this again. So, sum up this section. Cloud native deployments are getting more and more complex. You have to try and stay on top of everything that is coming up. And that's what I'm hoping to go over a little bit in this section of the talk, and basically look at some of the trends from cloud native across 2021. And I've roughly put these into 3 sections. So things relating to tech, tools, frameworks, things that are DevOps loosely, so related to people and processes. And then thirdly, ecosystem. So things that are generally between organizations, wider business trends. So here we go. First one, more Rust in cloud native projects. So most cloud native projects are still written in Golang, but Rust is an up and coming language. Well, I guess it's not really up and coming. It's been around for a few years now, but we're starting to really see it percolate through the cloud native projects. And more of those that are coming into CNCF are actually written in Rust as opposed to Go. Compared to some of the other languages here, Rust is very much newer and less well known. But I think this is a trend that speaks really well for Rust and the future of Rust. The second trend, again, we're within the tech tools and frameworks here. Cross-cloud becomes more real. So one of the original desires of cloud native was to make workloads portable. So you could run them on your own cloud, you could run them hybrid cloud across your own data centers and a public cloud provider, or you could run it multi-cloud where you're moving across different public cloud providers as needed. I would say that this has not actually played out as much as was hoped a few years ago. I think cloud and hybrid cloud are still, cloud and hybrid cloud, there's been success in. Multi-cloud, I think, is still more difficult. And one of the main challenges is that moving workloads is relatively straightforward and doable nowadays. Moving data around is still very, very difficult. And moving it out of the public cloud providers is also very expensive. And I think if there is a solution that can support the data being moved across cloud providers, that would be very, very interesting. So it's becoming more real, but I think we're still lacking a solution for moving data across cloud providers. The third trend is WebAssembly and eBPF. These two don't particularly have any connection from a technology perspective, but it's all about running containers and running cloud native in environments that are not are different from what they were traditionally, or what was different from what was possible a few years ago. So for example, in WebAssembly, you can compile C++, C or Rust into something that can run on your browser. And that means that you could run a full cloud native stack within your browser if that's what you wanted. And eBPF means that you can do kernel updates in a way that is safe and enables you to, again, just run cloud native in environments where you don't have the same level of control over the kernel. And one of these new modes is called Kubernetes for the Edge. I've called this Kubernetes for the Edge. So the idea of the edge is that you have the public cloud providers or your own data centers. You have certain data centers that are a little bit closer to the user, and then you have devices which are very close to the user. So things like watches, phones, computer, like their own devices. So the idea of this is to be able to push workloads closer to the user so that it's faster and they get a better user experience. And Kubernetes is a great tool for this because it allows you to move workloads easily and to test those and to roll those back and canary to a certain number of devices. So I think Kubernetes for the Edge has not come as far as I expected in 2021, but is still, there's a lot of interesting progress being made here. The fifth trend is called GitOps. I couldn't actually find a great diagram for this. This falls into the DevOps people and processes section. the idea of GitOps is to be able to control all of your infrastructure declaratively from YAML that you check into GitHub, and then you use something like Flux or Argo CD to push those changes to a live running system. And then Kubernetes does all the reconciliation. And that being able to store everything in Git means that you have this audit trail, you can roll back easily. And I think GitOps is a trend that a year ago was still pretty new and nascent. And nowadays GitOps is becoming part of best practices for a cloud native system. So GitOps is one that I think is really worth exploring if you haven't done so already. The sixth trend is called chaos engineering. And with chaos engineering, the idea is that you don't know what you don't know. And sometimes the best way to try it is just to induce a little bit of failure into the system and see what happens. So classically, you have pods. Each one contains a service and a sidecar like Envoy, and you add some kind of problem to it. For example, for 50% of your requests, they might come with a 10-second delay. And then you can test with 2 different versions of your service. What effect does this have? Does it crash your service? Does it cause downstream problems? Just how does it cope? And chaos engineering, I think, has not come, it is still relatively new. There's a couple of projects within CNCF which are perhaps helpful with this if you want to look at it. But I really like this approach where you just try and add a little bit of failure in advance so that you can see what the effect is. Trend number 7 is called the rise of FinOps. And in this survey, they asked, what are your top cloud initiatives? Again, this was 2020, a year ago. And you can see that absolute number one was optimizing your existing use of cloud and finding cloud cost savings. I think there is another one here on better financial reporting on cloud costs. And cloud has become a large part of a lot of organizations' spending. So obviously companies now want to find ways to control that and to report on that and to optimize it. If this is something that you're looking at, I would recommend FinOps Foundation, which is a sister foundation to CNCF and is mainly made up of practitioners who are looking at this. So I find FinOps very interesting myself. We moved on to the let's say organizational ecosystem trends now. The first one of these is a pluggable DevOps experience. I mean, as we were talking about at the beginning, containers, Kubernetes is really, really complicated. It takes a lot of learning to figure out how to understand the concepts and how to tie them together well. One of the things that is coming up is how can we make that developer experience and the operator experience better and provide a nice dashboard. So a lot of companies have been building their own. This one was open sourced by Spotify. It's called Backstage. And it's been picking up a bit of success. And one of the reasons is that it's a plugin architecture, which means that you can write your own plugins and put in different services behind it and expose those within this dashboard. So if you're thinking, man, all this cloud native stuff is just too complicated, it's going to take me months or years to figure it out, I would perhaps consider looking at a dashboard that gives you a bit of help and a bit of guidance. The 9th trend, which I don't think it's played out as much as I hoped it would, or I thought it would, is the service mesh consolidation. So the service meshes, check the time, I'm sort of running out of time here. Service meshes are basically ways to control communications between your services. So you can see this is Monzo, which is a startup bank in London, and how their services interact with each other. So it's just very complicated. And there have been quite a few attempts at providing a service mesh with different levels of features and complexity. But my hope is that within a year, maybe next year, 2022, we'll have fewer options rather than more options in this space. And number 10, end user driven open source. More and more, we're finding that open source is not just being driven by the large cloud providers, but also by end users who are actually facing these problems day in, day out. And they're writing, contributing open source code, guidelines, giving their experience on what works for them and what hasn't. And at CNCF, I launched something called the End User Technology Radar that categorizes different projects into different levels of adoption. And we asked some end users, why did you put this in here? What success have you seen with it? Do you actually recommend it or not? So I would recommend that you check out the End User Technology Radar, radar.cncf.io, and just take a look, understand what other people are doing. So, quick summary. I talked about how CNCF changed the way I think, with how it's the closest thing to public service in tech, how to set other people up for success in the future, not just today. Failure is an option. Try a lot of different things and try and, don't be afraid of failing. Don't have that scarcity mindset. Treat your career like your portfolio, diversify, do as many things as you can, get involved with people outside of your organization. And please do your leave here, enthusiastically support your people, not just, pay lip service to an abstract idea of diversity. And then the second half was, how do we stay on top of the complexity of cloud native deployments? And I'm going to just list all of these quickly. In the 3 sections that we talked about. So within tech, more Rust, getting closer towards cloud native becoming a reality, enabling new ways and new environments of running containers in cloud native. Within the DevOps area, GitOps, chaos engineering, and FinOps, I think are really interesting rising trends. And then in the ecosystem section, we talked about making the developer and operator experience better, having fewer rather than more service mesh options, and the rise of end users. I'm going to skip this video, but it is really fun. If you go on YouTube and search for CNCF end user Adidas, then they also have some extra advice and guidance for you. And thank you very much. That is it. These slides will be on my blog shortly at oicheryl.com. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. That was a really brave and impactful thing to talk about. That was really, I think that was really important what you spoke about. And then it was very informative, but it was also, like I said, very impactful and brave. So I really appreciated that. Something that I thought was really interesting is the question, or how can I give you more opportunities to do the things you want to do and find the things that maybe you want to do at later. And I think that's a great point to end on in thinking about the open source community in general, whether you're doing a mentorship, whether you're moderating a community or doing anything in the community, you're dealing with a lot of volunteers. And part of your mentorship isn't just helping them contribute, it's helping them get those opportunities and help them get to the next place in their career.
100%. I think it's so important to share the success and the opportunities that you have with other people. Something that can be very small for you, like a little introduction, can make a really big difference to other people's careers. And that's one of the joys of open source.
And sharing stories like what you shared was very brave. And there was someone asking in the comments before, how do I get started in a cloud native career? I think you gave 10 really great areas to look into if you're looking to go cloud native, and especially in hot topics. I think FinOps is really a very interesting topic, not spoken about enough, because when it comes down to it, that's what holds back developer autonomy sometimes, because you can't have so much cross functionality if you can't track it in finance. So it's very interesting.
It's the reality of how it works. Like, I really think FinOps is an area that has so much potential. it's probably been around for a year or two as an idea, but there's so much scope for it to grow in the future. So I'm excited for you if you're thinking of how to get into a cloud native career.
That's great for those people. Thank you so much and have a great day. Good luck with everything.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Really appreciate it. Take care.
And thank you, listeners. I'll check you back. We'll see you in tracks 1, 2, 3, and 4 in a few minutes. Thank you.